In a small, quiet town, where everyone seemed to know each other, an old black man named Mr. Leroy walked slowly through the streets. With his neatly trimmed grey hair, slightly worn glasses, and brown felt hat, he seemed like an ordinary man. His gait was calm, almost self-effacing, and he used a finely carved wooden cane. What few people knew was that Mr. Leroy was not an ordinary old man. Formerly, he was a recognized karate master, having won several national championships and trained hundreds of students. But glory didn't interest him. What mattered to him was the discipline, respect and wisdom that this ancestral art brought. That day, while waiting for his bus at the downtown stop, a group of 4 teenagers approached. They were loud, giggling loudly, their voices overlapping in an unpleasant cacophony. Their words were filled with arrogance and contempt, as if they sought to impose their youth, their raw energy, and to crush anything that could embody wisdom or tranquility. Among them, the leader of the group, a young man named Kevin, immediately stood out. He turned to Mr. Leroy with a smirk, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Look at this crumbling old man," Kevin said to his friends, pointing to Mr. Leroy. "It looks straight out of another century." His friends burst out laughing, imitating their comrades' mocking tone. Their laughter echoed in the air like hammer blows striking the dignity of the elderly man. But Mr. Leroy didn't move an inch. He remained there, motionless, his hands gently placed on his cane, observing the horizon with a tranquility that denoted more wisdom than simple passivity. The world around him seemed too noisy to be taken seriously.
"Hey, Grandpa, have you lost your plantation?"
Another boy asked, his insistent laugh hanging in the air.
"De Toon-chan."
This insult was no longer just a sign of their immaturity, but of their latent racism and their desire to trample on what they considered a vestige of the past.
"The word store through the atmosphere, loaded with hatred, contempt and ignorance."
However, Mr. Leroy still does not react. He didn't need to answer. Time and experience had taught him that a well-placed silence could sometimes be more powerful than an impulsive retort. He knew that young people like that fed off the reaction they provoked. But Kevin, not having gotten the answer he was hoping for, decided to push further. He approached Mr. Leroy with heightened arrogance, his heavy footsteps echoing on the pavement. He raised his hand, a mocking smile on his lips, and lightly tapped the elderly man's cane, pretending to want to tear it away. "Do you really need it? Are you sure you don't just want to walk around like an old Japanese sage?" Kevin said sarcastically, pointing to the cane with a theatrical gesture. Mr. Leroy's gaze slowly turned towards him. A simple movement of the head, but this look, calm, unfathomable, seemed to transfix the young man. There was an intensity in his eyes that was not anger, but something deeper, wiser. It was a look that spoke volumes about years of hardship, struggle and dignity under pressure. "Respect is an art that few people have mastered," he said in a calm voice, almost too calm to be taken seriously. Kevin chuckled loudly. "Oh, do you hear that? He's teaching us a lesson in respect, guys," he replied, looking at his friends, as if he were the master of the world. The teenagers burst out laughing, reveling in their temporary power over this elderly man, in the superiority they believed themselves capable of imposing. But the air between them suddenly became heavier, more tense. The arrogance was palpable, but something indefinable was creeping into the situation. Spurred on by his arrogance, Kevin reached out to grab Mr. Leroy's cane. He intended to humiliate him even more, to show that the man was just a defenseless old man. That time had only weakened him. But it was a serious mistake. In a split second, Mr. Leroy spun around, his movements quick and precise, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The cane instantly slipped from Kevin's grip. Without the young man even understanding what was happening, he felt pressure on the back of his knee. In a flash, he lost his balance and collapsed abruptly to the ground, his pride shattered in an instant. The sound of impact was heard, and a suddenly heavy silence fell over the group. Kevin, stunned, tried to stand up, his face red with shame, his arrogance gone in an instant. The scene, although so banal in its beginning, had taken a completely different turn. "What did you do there, old man?" Kevin growled, clenching his fists, his face contorting with anger and confusion. His friends backed away slightly, their mocking expression erased by sudden unease. They felt that they had just awakened something in Mr. Leroy that they did not understand, something greater than their insolence. Their laughter faded, and a heavy tension crept between them, spreading like a shadow. "I simply showed you what you refused to learn," replied Mr. Leroy in a calm but serious voice. Each word seemed to weigh heavier than the last. Furious and humiliated, Kevin, in a burst of uncontrollable anger, rushed at him, his fists clenched, determined to regain control of the situation. His mind was overwhelmed by the idea of avenging his wounded honor, but Mr. Leroy did not allow himself to be trapped by his anger. In a movement as fluid as that of a dancer, he dodged the punch with disconcerting ease. His movements were measured, precise, as if each gesture had been repeated 1,000,000 times. He shifted slightly to the side, pivoting with an agility one wouldn't expect from a man his age, and with a flick of the wrist, he knocked Kevin off balance a second time. The young man found himself on the ground, his back hitting the pavement with unexpected violence. This time, silence reigned.
Nobody laughs.
None of the teenagers even dared to exchange a glance. They were frozen, as if the reality of what had just happened paralyzed them. Kevin, who had thought himself superior, found himself on the ground, his ego shattered, his pride soiled, and his mind muddled. The other teenagers began to back away, one by one, realizing that they had chosen the wrong target, that they were facing someone much larger than they had imagined. Mr. Leroy slowly advanced towards Kevin, who remained there, lying on the ground, his face marked by shame and incomprehension. The air was heavy with the silent tension that precedes a big turning point. Mr. Leroy wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. His features remained impassive, anchored in a serenity that seemed to resist the tumult of the world around him. He reached out to the boy, not in a gesture of vengeance, but in an act of compassion. He was not trying to demean him further, but to offer him an opportunity.
Shamed and confused, Kevin hesitated for a moment.
He stood up slowly, his eyes fleeing those of Mr. Leroy, unable to hold this gaze imbued with infinite wisdom. He finally took the outstretched hand, and the old man helped him up with a gentleness that contrasted with the brutality of the fight that had just taken place. Once standing, Kevin looked down, unable to meet the old man's gaze. He suddenly felt very small, very insignificant, a simple boy who had believed he could dominate someone he didn't even understand. "Do you really want to be strong, Kevin?" Mr. Leroy asked, his voice soft but firm. There was a profound question in his words, a call for reflection greater than that of the moment. Kevin remained silent, his thoughts jumbled, as if the old man's words had dug a furrow in his mind. He felt helpless, lost between his desire to show his power and what he had just learned in a split second. "Because if you're looking for strength, then I can teach you what it really means," Mr. Leroy continued. "But if you only seek to humiliate others, then you will always end up falling." These words echoed in Kevin's head, like echoes repeating themselves over and over again. For a moment, he wondered who this man really was, this serene stranger, who seemed to know truths that he himself had never touched upon. He looked at the other teenagers, who were just as lost as he was, and he knew that something had just broken in the air. An innocence, an ignorance, something they had taken for granted, had just crumbled before their noses. "What was that?" one of the teenagers whispered to his friend, a slight tremor in his voice. "I don't know, but I think we've just been humiliated," replied another, his eyes wide, as if he had just seen something he wasn't ready to see. Mr. Leroy turned on his heel, without another word, and walked away slowly. The cane gently struck the ground with each step, like a metronome marking the tempo of this silent lesson. He didn't turn around. He didn't need this. He knew the lesson had been taught, and now Kevin and his friends had to deal with what they did with it. That day, Kevin and his friends learned a lesson they would never forget. It was not the lesson of a simple physical confrontation, but that of an unshakable dignity, of a wisdom that does not allow itself to be crushed by arrogance or violence. A few weeks later, after nights of reflections and doubts, Kevin found himself in front of the door of an old abandoned dojo, where he had heard that a certain Mr. Leroy still gave a few lessons to those who sought to understand the true meaning of the word respect. He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing, but he knew he was ready to learn.